The morning sunlight filtered through the old, tattered curtains, casting a dim glow inside the small house on the edge of town. Jack Miller's home looked like a place forgotten by time. The wooden walls were weathered, the porch sagged on one side, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. Inside, things weren't much better. A worn-out armchair, a scratched coffee table, and an old TV that played shows Jack never watched filled the room. On the table, a nearly empty bottle of whiskey lay next to a dirty glass. Jack sat in the armchair, his empty gaze fixed on the window. He wasn't really looking at anything. His mind was trapped somewhere else in another time. Gunfire echoed in his head, the screams of his comrades and the image of Danny, a young soldier with a bright smile, flashed vividly before him. Jack shut his eyes tightly, trying to push the memories away, but they only grew stronger. Last night, Jack had dreamed of the ambush again. In the dream, he and his team were patrolling a narrow road in Afghanistan. The sun blazed overhead, and the air was so stifling it was hard to breathe. Jack remembered every detail: the smell of dust, the heavy sound of boots on sand, and the creeping sense of unease. Then the explosion came. A roadside bomb detonated right in front of them. Everything descended into chaos. Gunfire erupted from all sides, and Jack shouted orders for his team to take cover. Danny, the youngest soldier in the squad, was hit while trying to protect his comrades. Jack could still see the fear in Danny's eyes as he fell, but there was also trust in them. "You won't leave me behind, right?" Danny had said. But Jack could do nothing except order the retreat to save the rest of the team. When he woke up, Jack always felt as though he could still hear Danny's voice calling out to him, echoing in his mind. Jack jolted awake from the dream, cold sweat running down his back. He sat up, reached for the whiskey bottle on the table, and poured himself a full glass. It was the only way he knew to dull the pain of the memories. He took a long drink, the burning sensation spreading down his throat, but it did nothing to ease the ache in his chest. Jack's days passed in monotonous repetition. He had no friends, no family, and no purpose. The only work he did was fixing old, broken things: a busted radio, a clock that wouldn't tick, or anything else the townsfolk brought to him. It was his way of passing the time, the only way he felt remotely useful. That morning, as Jack bent over a rusty lawnmower trying to get it working again, he heard the light sound of footsteps on the overgrown path leading to his house. He looked up and saw a young girl standing there, holding a battered bicycle. She was about 12 years old, with her hair tied in two pigtails, wearing an oversized t-shirt and ripped jeans. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, though there was a hint of shyness in her expression. "You're Mr. Jack, right?" the girl asked in a clear, bright voice. Jack frowned, not answering immediately. He wasn't used to people approaching him, especially not a child. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice rough. "My bike's broken. My mom said you're good at fixing things, so I brought it here," the girl said, pushing the bike toward him. "I'm Emma. I live across the street." Jack glanced at the bike. The chain had slipped off, and the back wheel was slightly bent. He sighed, not wanting to get involved, but something in Emma's eyes made it hard to refuse. "Leave it there," he said curtly, then turned back to the lawnmower. Emma didn't leave right away. She stood there watching Jack work. "Do you live here alone?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity. Jack didn't answer. He didn't like being asked about his life, especially by a child, but Emma wasn't deterred. "You've got a lot of old stuff. Are you a collector or something?" "No," Jack replied shortly, his eyes still focused on the lawnmower. "Then why do you fix old things? Don't you get bored?" Emma pressed on. Jack looked up at her, his brow furrowed. "Do you always ask this many questions?" he asked, his tone tinged with irritation. Emma grinned, unfazed by his gruff demeanor. "My mom says I'm too curious, but I think being curious is a good thing, don't you?" Jack didn't respond. He turned back to his work, hoping she'd get bored and leave, but Emma stayed put, watching him with an eager expression. Finally, Jack sighed and said, "If you want your bike fixed, it's best to leave me alone." Emma nodded, but instead of leaving, sat down on the front steps and began playing with a small rock. "I'll wait," she said. It took Jack about 30 minutes to fix the bike. When he stood up, Emma immediately ran over, her eyes lighting up. "You're done? Wow, you're really good at this," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Jack didn't respond, simply pushing the bike toward her. "It's done. Next time, oil the chain," he said. Emma beamed, taking the bike and wheeling it toward the gate. But before she left, she turned back and said, "Thanks, Mr. Jack. If my bike breaks again, I'll come back." Jack watched her ride off down the road, her small figure disappearing into the distance. He shook his head, telling himself she'd get bored and stop coming around. But deep down, he knew her presence had disrupted the solitude he'd grown so accustomed to, and that made him feel both uneasy and strangely intrigued. As the sun set, Jack sat on the front steps of his house, the whiskey bottle in his hand. He stared at the road where Emma had disappeared earlier, and for a brief moment, he felt something different, a tiny flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness of his life. But then, as always, the memories of Danny came rushing back, pulling him down into the familiar pit of guilt and pain. Jack took another swig of whiskey, trying to drown out the image of the young soldier, but he knew the ghosts of his past would never truly leave him. The morning was quiet, as it always was in the small, sleepy town. Jack Miller sat on the porch of his run-down house, a cigarette dangling between his fingers. The smoke curled lazily into the air, dissipating into the pale blue sky. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in the fog of memories he couldn't escape. The whiskey bottle from the night before still sat on the porch railing, half empty, a silent witness to his restless nights. Jack's solitude was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up in front of his house. He frowned, squinting at the unfamiliar vehicle. It was a small, clean sedan, too polished for this part of town. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was in her late 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and a professional but approachable demeanor. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, and her eyes scanned the house with a mix of hesitation and determination. Jack recognized her immediately. It had been years, but there was no mistaking Sarah Thompson. She had been his classmate in high school, back when life was simpler, back when he was someone else entirely. Jack's frown deepened as she approached, her heels clicking softly on the cracked pavement of his driveway. "Jack," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "It's been a long time." Jack didn't respond right away. He took a drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly, and finally muttered, "Sarah, what are you doing here?" She smiled faintly, though there was a hint of sadness in her expression. "I heard you were back in town. I work with the county now, social services. I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." Jack snorted, a bitter sound. "Social services, huh? So what, you're here to check if I'm a charity case?" Sarah's smile faltered, but she didn't back down. "I'm here because I care, Jack. We used to be friends, remember?" Jack didn't answer. He stubbed out his cigarette on the porch railing and stood up, towering over her. "Well, as you can see, I'm doing just fine. You can go now." But Sarah didn't move. She crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "You don't look fine to me, Jack. You look like someone who's been through hell and hasn't found his way back." Jack's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about what I've been through." "You're right," Sarah said softly. "I don't. But I know you're not the same person you used to be, and I know you don't have to go through this alone." Jack turned away, retreating into the safety of his porch. He picked up the whiskey bottle and poured himself a small measure, ignoring Sarah's disapproving look. "I don't need your pity," he said, his voice low and rough, "and I sure as hell don't need your help." Sarah stepped closer, her tone firm but gentle. "It's not pity, Jack. It's concern. There's a group in town, a support group for veterans. They meet every week at the community center. I think it could help you." Jack let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "A support group? You think sitting in a circle and talking about my feelings is going to fix anything? You think that's going to bring back the people I lost?" "No," Sarah admitted, "but it might help you find a way to live with it." Jack's hand tightened around the glass. He stared at the amber liquid, his reflection distorted in its surface. "People like me don't get fixed, Sarah. We're broken for good." Sarah's expression softened, but her resolve didn't waver. "You're not broken, Jack. You're hurting, and that's okay, but you don't have to do it alone." Jack didn't respond. He downed the whiskey in one gulp and set the glass down with a sharp clink. "Thanks for stopping by," he said, his tone final, "but I'm not interested." Sarah hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave. She glanced around the porch, her eyes lingering on the peeling paint and the clutter of tools and broken objects. "You know," she said after a moment, "this isn't the Jack I remember." Jack stiffened, but didn't look at her. "People change." "Do they?" Sarah countered. "Because the Jack I knew in high school was a leader. He was the guy everyone looked up to. You were captain of the football team, president of the student council. You had big dreams, Jack. You wanted to make a difference." Jack's shoulders tensed, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he turned to face her, his eyes hard. "That was a long time ago. That kid doesn't exist anymore." Sarah took a step closer, her voice softening. Maybe not, but I think he's still in there somewhere, and I think you owe it to yourself to find him again. Jack's chest tightened. Her words stirred something deep inside him, something he had buried long ago. He remembered those days, Friday night games under the stadium lights, the roar of the crowd, the feeling of invincibility. He remembered the way people used to look at him, like he could do anything, be anything. And he remembered the promises he had made to himself, the dreams he had chased. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by the man he had become. The leader he once was had failed when it mattered most. He had led his team into an ambush, and he had left Danny behind. The weight of that failure crushed any hope of reclaiming the person he used to be. "You don't get it," Jack said finally, his voice low and strained. "I'm not that guy anymore. I can't be." Sarah's eyes filled with sympathy, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small card. She set it on the porch railing. "The group meets on Thursdays at 7, she said. "If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." Jack didn't look at the card. He stared out at the road, his expression unreadable. Sarah lingered for a moment as if she wanted to say more, but then she turned and walked back to her car. Jack watched her drive away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. When she was gone, Jack picked up the card and stared at it. The words blurred in his vision, and he felt a surge of anger. He crumpled the card in his fist and threw it onto the porch. Then he sat back down, reaching for the whiskey bottle. But as he poured himself another drink, Sarah's words echoed in his mind. "You're not broken, Jack. You're hurting, and that's okay." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that there was still a way out of the darkness, but the memories of the past were too strong, too painful. They clung to him like a shadow, refusing to let go. Jack took a long drink, the burn of the whiskey doing little to numb the ache in his chest. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he could almost hear the cheers of the crowd, the laughter of his friends, the voice of a younger, more hopeful version of himself. But then the gunfire returned, and the screams, and Danny's voice calling out to him. Jack opened his eyes, the weight of the present crashing down on him once more. He was alone again, just as he had been for years. And deep down, he believed that was exactly where he belonged. That night, Jack dreamed again. Nightmares were no stranger to him, but every time they returned, they left him waking up drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding as if it might burst. In his dream, he was back there, in the dense jungle where sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy, and the air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Gunfire echoed everywhere, tearing apart the stillness of the forest. Jack remembered every detail vividly, the screams of his comrades, the frantic footsteps as they scrambled for cover, and his own ragged breaths as he tried to stay calm. It was an ambush. They had been tricked, led into a trap no one in the team had seen coming until it was too late. "Retreat!" Jack shouted, his voice cracking amidst the chaos. "Fall back now!" The soldiers in his unit, the ones who trusted him, began retreating one by one toward safety, but not all of them. Danny, the young rookie, was still there. Jack turned and saw Danny struggling to drag a wounded comrade out of the line of fire. He was only 19, his face still boyish, his eyes filled with determination but also fear. "Danny, leave him! Run now!" Jack yelled, but Danny didn't listen. He kept trying, kept fighting until a loud explosion rang out. Jack saw Danny fall, blood staining his uniform. "No!" Jack screamed, but his legs wouldn't move. He was trapped between life and death, between the responsibility of saving his team and the agony of leaving someone behind. In the end, he gave the order to retreat, leaving Danny behind. It was the right decision to save the team, but it was also the decision that had haunted him ever since. In the dream, Danny didn't stay down like in Jack's memory. He stood up, his face bloodied, his eyes glaring at Jack. "Why did you leave me?" Danny asked, his voice echoing like a call from the depths of hell. "Why didn't you come back?" Jack tried to explain, but no words came out. He just stood there, helpless, as Danny stepped closer, one step at a time. "You were the captain. You were the one we trusted. And you left me." "No, I didn't have a choice," Jack stammered, but Danny didn't listen. He just repeated the question. "Why did you leave me?" Jack jolted awake, his breathing ragged, his shirt soaked in sweat. He sat up, running a hand over his face, trying to shake off the image of Danny, but it lingered, like a ghost that refused to leave. The next morning, Jack tried to push the dream out of his mind. He walked out of his room and saw Emma, his 10-year-old niece, sitting on the living room floor, rummaging through an old box he had left forgotten in the corner. The box was filled with mementos from his time in the military, medals, maps, and old photographs. "Emma, what are you doing?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse from a sleepless night. Emma looked up, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I found this in the closet. Is this you?" She held up an old photograph of Jack standing in the middle of a group of young soldiers, all smiling brightly. Danny was there too, standing right next to Jack, his face glowing with an innocent grin. Jack felt his chest tighten as he looked at the photo. He walked over and snatched it from Emma's hands. "Don't touch this stuff," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. Emma frowned, surprised by her uncle's reaction. "I just wanted to know. You were their captain, right? And who's this?" She pointed at Danny in the photo. "No one," Jack replied coldly. He shoved the photo back into the box and closed the lid. "Don't ever bring up the war in front of me again. Do you understand?" Emma fell silent, her wide eyes staring at Jack. She had never seen her uncle like this before. Jack was always quiet, reserved, but he had never been angry like this. "I'm sorry," Emma said softly, then stood up and left the room, leaving Jack alone with the box. Jack sat down, opened the lid again, and picked up the photo. He stared at Danny's face, and the memories came flooding back like a tidal wave, washing away all his efforts to forget. He remembered the first time he met Danny, a kid fresh out of high school, full of enthusiasm and dreams. Danny always talked about wanting to do something great, to protect his country, to be a hero. But war wasn't a place for dreams. It was a place where kids like Danny were crushed, where men like Jack had to make unforgivable decisions. Jack clenched the photo in his hand, the guilt rising in his chest. He had tried to forget, tried to move on, but Danny was always there, in his dreams, in his memories, and now in Emma's curious eyes. He couldn't run forever, but he didn't know how to face it either. Jack put the photo back in the box, closed the lid, and shoved it into the corner of the closet. He stood up and walked out onto the porch where the morning sunlight was streaming down. He lit a cigarette, taking a deep drag, trying to push the images out of his mind. But no matter how hard he tried, Danny's voice echoed in his head. "Why did you leave me?" Jack closed his eyes, feeling the gentle breeze brush against his face. He knew he couldn't keep living like this, but how could he let go of the past? How could he forgive himself? He didn't have the answers. All he knew was that with each passing day, he felt himself sinking deeper into the darkness, and somewhere in the hidden corners of his soul, Jack wondered if he would ever find peace. Jack was sitting on the old chair on his porch, a half-burned cigarette in his hand, when the phone rang. He stared at the phone on the table, a sense of unease rising in his chest. No one usually called him, and unexpected calls rarely brought good news. He stubbed out the cigarette in the ashtray and reached for the phone. "Jack Miller here," he said, his voice rough. "Jack, it's me, Linda," the voice on the other end said, heavy and somber. Linda was Mike's ex-wife, Jack's closest friend from the war. Just hearing her voice, Jack already knew something was wrong. "What's going on, Linda?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Linda took a deep breath before answering. "It's Mike. He tried to kill himself in rehab." Jack felt like someone had punched him in the chest. He gripped the phone tightly, trying to stay calm. "Is he okay? Did he make it?" "The doctors say he'll live, but he's still very weak. Before he passed out, Mike left a message. He said he needs to talk to you. About Danny." That name hit Jack like a knife to the heart. Danny. The name he had tried to bury for years. The name tied to pain, loss, and an unshakable guilt. Jack stayed silent, unsure of what to say. "Jack, are you still there?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah, I'm here," Jack replied, his voice barely audible. "Where is he?" "St. Mary's Rehab Center, about 2 hours from here. Jack, I think you should go see him. Mike needs you." Jack didn't respond immediately. He felt like a heavy weight was pressing down on his chest. "I'll think about it," he said, then hung up before Linda could say anything else. Jack sat silently on the porch, staring into the empty space in front of him. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust, but he didn't notice. His mind was spinning with old memories, images he had tried so hard to forget. Mike and Jack had once been inseparable. They met in the army, surviving brutal battles together, sharing fears and hopes. Mike was the only one who truly understood what Jack had been through because he carried the same invisible scars of war. But after they returned home, everything began to change. Mike drowned himself in alcohol and drugs, trying to numb the pain he couldn't speak of. Jack, though equally scarred, chose to isolate himself, cutting off everyone, including Mike. Now, hearing that Mike had tried to take his own life, Jack couldn't help but feel guilty. He had known Mike was struggling, but he had done nothing to help. He had left his friend to face his demons alone, just as he had left Danny behind. Danny. That name surfaced in Jack's mind again, like a ghost that refused to leave. Why did Mike want to talk about Danny? That had happened years ago, but it still haunted both of them. Jack knew Mike also felt guilty about Danny's death, even though the responsibility lay with him, the captain who had given the order to retreat. Jack stood up and walked into the house. He saw the bottle of whiskey on the table, but this time he didn't reach for it. Instead, he sat down in the chair, his head bowed, his hands covering his face. He knew what he had to do. He had to go see Mike, but the thought of it terrified him. He was afraid to face Mike, to hear what he had to say, and to confront the memories he had tried so hard to bury. The next morning, Jack woke up earlier than usual. He stood in front of the mirror staring at his reflection. Deep wrinkles lined his face, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and an exhaustion he couldn't hide was etched into his features. He looked like a man who had lived through a lifetime of war, even though the war had ended long ago. Jack put on an old shirt and a pair of jeans, then walked out to his truck. He sat behind the wheel but didn't start the engine right away. He stared at the steering wheel, the hesitation creeping back in. He had lived in isolation for so long, avoiding people, avoiding the past. But now, the past was calling him, forcing him to face it. "Damn it," Jack muttered, then turned the key. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence. He drove off the dirt road, heading toward St. Mary's Rehab Center. 2 hours later, Jack pulled up in front of the rehab center. The building looked old but clean, with white painted walls and a small garden out front. Jack stepped inside, the unease in his chest growing stronger. He didn't know what he would say to Mike or what Mike would say to him, but he knew he couldn't keep running. A nurse led Jack to Mike's room. It was a small room with a single bed and a window overlooking the garden. Mike lay on the bed, his face gaunt, his eyes closed. He looked like a shadow of himself, a man worn down by war and years of suffering. "He just woke up this morning," the nurse said, "but he's still very weak. Don't talk for too long." Jack nodded and stepped into the room. He sat down in the chair next to the bed, looking at Mike. After a moment, Mike opened his eyes, and when he saw Jack, a faint smile appeared on his lips. "Jack," Mike said, his voice hoarse and weak. "You came." "Yeah, I'm here," Jack replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "What the hell were you thinking, Mike? Were you just going to give up?" Mike let out a weak laugh. "I'm tired, Jack, tired of fighting myself. But before I go, I knew I had to talk to you, about Danny." Jack felt his chest tighten. He looked at Mike, waiting, but also dreading what he was about to say. "You're not the only one who feels guilty, Jack," Mike said, his voice trembling. "I do too. I was there. I saw Danny fall, and I didn't do anything to save him." Jack lowered his head, saying nothing. He knew that both of them carried the weight of the past, and maybe only by facing it could they find some kind of release. "We need to talk, Jack," Mike said, his eyes serious. "Not just about Danny, but about everything. We can't keep living like this." Jack nodded, feeling a tear roll down his cheek. He knew this was the moment to confront the past, to seek forgiveness, and maybe to start over. That afternoon, Jack was sitting on his porch as usual, a half-burned cigarette in his hand. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, painting the dirt road in golden hues. He was lost in vague thoughts when he suddenly heard hurried footsteps. Before he could turn around, Emma appeared, her face flushed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Emma?" Jack stood up abruptly, tossing the cigarette to the ground. "What's wrong?" Emma didn't answer right away. She ran straight into Jack's arms, clutching him tightly, her small shoulders trembling. Jack could feel the desperation in her embrace, and it worried him more than anything. "What happened? Did something happen at school?" Jack asked, his voice softening, trying not to scare her further. Emma looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen, her voice choked with sobs. "I hate school. I hate everyone there. They hate me. They bully me, and I feel so useless. Nobody cares about me." Jack felt his chest tighten. He wasn't good at comforting others, especially a child. But seeing Emma like this, he knew he couldn't stay silent. He led her into the house, poured her a glass of water, and sat down beside her. "Tell me what happened," Jack said, his voice low and gentle. "What's going on?" Emma wiped her tears and took a deep breath before starting to speak. "At school, there's this group of kids who always tease me. They call me stupid, a loser. Today, they even tore up my notebook and laughed at me in front of everyone. I didn't know what to do. I just wanted to disappear." Jack froze. He looked at her, feeling the pain and helplessness in every word she said. Emma was only 10 years old, but what she was going through felt far too heavy for someone her age. He didn't know what to say to ease her pain, but he knew he couldn't let her feel alone. "Emma," Jack began, his voice slow and deliberate. "You're not useless, and you're not alone. I know what it feels like to be stuck, to feel like no one cares, but that's not true." Emma looked at Jack, her eyes still glistening with tears. "You felt like that too?" Jack nodded, his gaze distant. He didn't want to talk about his past, but he knew Emma needed to hear something, a story that could help her understand she wasn't weak or worthless. "Do you know about Danny?" Jack asked, his voice dropping lower. Emma shook her head. "Who's Danny?" Jack took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for a storm within. "Danny was a young soldier in my unit many years ago. He was only 19, younger than everyone else in the team. He wasn't the strongest, and he wasn't the best. But he had a big heart, and he always tried his hardest." Emma listened intently, her wide eyes fixed on Jack. He continued, his voice growing heavier with the weight of memory. "One day our team was ambushed. It was a bad situation, and we were all scared. I gave the order to retreat to save the team, but Danny, he stayed behind. He tried to help a wounded teammate even though he knew it was dangerous, and in the end he sacrificed himself." Emma covered her mouth, her eyes welling up again. He died?" Jack nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Yes. But you know what? Danny wasn't the strongest, but he did the right thing when it mattered. That's real courage. It's not about being fearless. It's about facing your fear and doing what's right." Emma sat quietly, processing Jack's words. After a moment, she asked, "Do you think I could be brave like Danny?" Jack looked at her, feeling a dull ache in his chest. He didn't want Emma to see him as a hero, because he knew he didn't deserve it, but he also didn't want her to feel weak or worthless. "You don't have to be like Danny," Jack said, his voice gentle. "You just have to be yourself. Courage doesn't mean not being afraid. It means not letting fear control you. You're stronger than you think, Emma, and you're never alone. I'm always here." Emma looked at Jack, her eyes brightening just a little. "Thank you, Jack," she said softly, then hugged him tightly. Jack felt the warmth of Emma's embrace, but at the same time he felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders. Emma was starting to see him as a hero, someone she could rely on, but Jack knew the truth. He wasn't a hero. He was a man haunted by his past, a man who had failed when it truly mattered. When Emma left, Jack sat alone on the porch. He stared out at the dirt road, the evening sunlight fading into darkness. He felt a familiar pain rising in his chest, but this time, it was accompanied by something else: responsibility. Jack knew he couldn't change the past, couldn't bring Danny back, and couldn't erase his mistakes. But he could do one thing. He could be there for Emma, so she would never feel as alone or as worthless as he once did. And maybe, just maybe, in doing so, he could find a small measure of peace within himself. Jack walked slowly down the long hospital hallway, his heavy boots echoing against the white-tiled floor. The air was cold, and the sharp smell of disinfectant filled his nose, making him uncomfortable. He hated hospitals, hated the sterile white walls and the suffocating silence. But today he had no choice. He had to be here, had to face Mike and himself. When he reached Mike's room, Jack stopped and took a deep breath. He didn't know what he was going to say or what Mike would say, but he knew this meeting wouldn't be easy. He knocked lightly on the door, then pushed it open. Mike was lying on the bed, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken and dark. He looked like a man who had been worn down by years of suffering and the demons in his mind. When he saw Jack, Mike gave a faint smirk, but it wasn't a smile. It was a bitter expression, a mix of exhaustion and resentment. "Jack," Mike said, his voice hoarse, "you finally came." "Yeah, I'm here," Jack replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He pulled up a chair and sat down next to the bed, his eyes fixed on Mike. "You wanted to talk. I'm here." Mike stared at Jack for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then suddenly, he let out a dry, bitter laugh. "You know, Jack, I've been thinking about Danny a lot. He's always in my head, even when I try to forget." Jack felt his chest tighten at the mention of that name. Danny, the name he had tried to bury for years. I think about him too, Jack said, his voice low. But you know, we can't change the past. Can't change the past? Mike repeated, his voice suddenly sharp. That's easy for you to say, Jack. But have you ever asked yourself why Danny died? Why he had to sacrifice himself? Jack frowned, a wave of unease rising in his chest. What the hell are you talking about, Mike? You think I don't know? I gave the order to retreat. That was my decision. If I hadn't, the whole team would have died. Yes, you gave the order to retreat, Mike said, his voice dripping with bitterness. But have you ever thought about how you left Danny behind? He trusted you, Jack. He trusted that you'd save him. Mike's words hit Jack like a knife to the heart. He felt anger bubbling up inside him, unable to hold it back any longer. You think I don't know that? Jack shouted, his voice echoing through the room. You think I don't blame myself every damn day? If I hadn't given that order, the whole team would have died. I didn't have a choice. Mike stayed silent, his cold gaze fixed on Jack. After a moment, he let out a bitter chuckle. You always say you didn't have a choice, but did you ever hear what Danny said before he died? Jack froze. He stared at Mike, feeling as though the world around him had slowed to a crawl. What are you talking about, Mike? What do you know? Mike took a deep breath as if summoning the last of his strength. Danny. He volunteered to stay behind, Jack. He knew that if no one held the enemy back, the team wouldn't make it out alive. He chose to stay, not because you ordered him to, but because he wanted to protect everyone. Jack felt like someone had punched him in the chest. He couldn't breathe. He volunteered? Jack repeated, his voice trembling. Mike nodded, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. Before he died, Danny asked me to tell you something, but I didn't have the courage to say it. Until now. Jack stared at Mike, feeling as though the ground beneath him was crumbling. What did he say? Jack asked, his voice barely audible. Mike looked Jack straight in the eye, his voice soft but firm. He said, Don't blame yourself. You did the right thing. Those words hit Jack like a tidal wave, washing over him and breaking down the walls he had built around his guilt. He felt tears welling up in his eyes, rolling down his cheeks. He had carried the weight of Danny's death for years, blaming himself for the young soldier's sacrifice. But now he knew that Danny didn't blame him. Danny had understood, and Danny had forgiven him. Jack lowered his head, his hands covering his face. He didn't know how long he sat there, but when he finally looked up, Mike was still watching him, his expression softer now. You're not the only one who feels guilty, Jack, Mike said, his voice gentler. I do too, but we can't keep living like this. Danny sacrificed himself so we could live. We owe him that. Jack nodded, feeling a dull ache in his chest, but this time, it wasn't an unbearable burden. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could do one thing, live, and live in a way that honored Danny's sacrifice. Thank you, Mike, Jack said, his voice hoarse. Thank you for telling me. Mike gave a faint smile, weak but genuine. We'll be okay, Jack. We have to be. Jack stood up, looking at Mike one last time before leaving the room. As he walked out of the hospital, he felt as though a part of the weight he had carried for so long had been lifted. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he didn't have to walk it alone. He would live, not just for himself, but for Danny, and for everyone who had believed in him. Jack sat on the old wooden chair on his porch, his gaze wandering aimlessly down the dirt road in front of him. The late afternoon sun cast a soft golden glow through the trees, but he barely noticed. In his hand was a cup of cold coffee, untouched, held more out of habit than anything else. Mike's words still echoed in his mind like a sad, unending melody. Danny said, Don't blame yourself. You did the right thing. But did he truly believe that? Jack wasn't sure. He had lived with guilt for so long that it had become a part of him, like a shadow he couldn't separate from. And now, even though Danny had forgiven him, he still couldn't forgive himself. The sound of a car pulling up in front of the house broke Jack's train of thought. He looked up and saw Sarah stepping out of her familiar sedan. She wore a simple white blouse and jeans, looking casual yet confident. Sarah smiled when she saw Jack, but he only nodded in response, saying nothing. Jack, Sarah said as she walked up the porch steps, I think we need to talk. Jack sighed and set the coffee cup down on the table. I don't think I'm in the mood for a conversation, Sarah. That's exactly why I'm here, she replied, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. I know you're going through a lot, but you can't just sit here and let the past eat away at you forever. Jack frowned, his gaze hardening. You don't understand, Sarah. You don't know what I've done. You don't know how I let Danny die." Sarah didn't flinch at Jack's anger. She met his gaze with steady determination. "You're right. I don't know everything. But I do know one thing. You can't keep living like this. You need to face your past, Jack. It's the only way you'll ever be able to move forward." Jack let out a bitter laugh, the sound dry and hollow. "Face my past? You think I haven't tried? I live with it every day, Sarah. I don't need to face it. I'm already drowning in it." Sarah shook her head, her voice gentle but firm. "No, Jack, you're not facing it. You're running from it. You think that blaming yourself is enough, that your guilt will somehow make up for what happened, but it doesn't work that way." Jack stayed silent, his eyes avoiding hers. He knew Sarah was right, but he didn't want to admit it. He didn't want to face the truth that he had been hiding, that he had let fear control him. "You need to go see Danny's family," Sarah said, her tone soft but persuasive. "You need to apologize to them, not because they need to hear it, but because you need to say it. You need to free yourself from this burden." Jack shot up from his chair, his voice rising in anger. "No, they'll never forgive me, Sarah. You don't understand. I let their son die. I gave the order to retreat, and Danny sacrificed himself because of my decision. How could they ever forgive me?" Sarah stood as well, facing Jack head on. "Maybe they won't forgive you. But that's not the point, Jack. The point is that you need to face them, to tell them the truth. You can't keep living in this darkness forever." Jack turned away, gripping the porch railing with both hands. He felt like a storm was raging inside him. He knew Sarah was right, but the fear inside him was overwhelming. He was terrified of looking into Danny's parents' eyes, of facing the pain he had caused them. And more than anything, he was afraid they would say the same things he had been telling himself for years, that he was a coward, that he had failed. "You don't understand, Sarah," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "I can't do it. I'm not strong enough." Sarah stepped closer, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Jack. You survived the war. You survived years of loneliness. But surviving isn't the same as living. You need to face your fears, or they'll consume you." Jack didn't respond. He just stood there staring out at the dirt road, feeling like he was standing at a crossroads with no idea which way to go. Part of him wanted to follow Sarah's advice, to seek forgiveness and find peace, but another part of him was paralyzed by fear, afraid that he wouldn't be able to handle rejection, afraid of being blamed. When Sarah left, Jack remained on the porch alone. Darkness slowly crept in, and the stars began to appear in the sky. He felt torn between two worlds, one of fear and guilt, and another of hope and redemption. Jack knew he couldn't keep living like this forever, but did he have the courage to face his past? Could he find forgiveness, not just from Danny's family, but from himself? He didn't know, but for the first time in years, Jack felt a faint glimmer of light in the darkness. And maybe, just maybe, the only way to find that light was to step into the shadows and confront what lay within. That night, the sky was pitch black, with not a single star in sight. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the chill of the approaching winter. Inside Jack's small house, the dim light of a table lamp cast faint shadows on the worn walls, creating an oppressive and suffocating atmosphere. On the table, a nearly empty bottle of whiskey lay on its side, next to a glass that had tipped over, leaving a dark stain on the wooden surface. Jack sat slumped in his chair, his head bowed, the bottle clutched tightly in his hand. The sharp smell of alcohol filled the room, but it wasn't enough to drown out the storm raging inside him. Memories of Danny, of Mike, of the war, they all screamed in his mind like relentless demons. He had tried to forget, tried to bury them with drink, but the more he drank, the clearer they became. "Damn it!" Jack roared, hurling the bottle to the floor. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the room, shards scattering everywhere. He staggered to his feet, unsteady, and punched the wall with all his strength. "Why? Why can't I forget?" He looked around the room, and everything seemed to mock him. The table, the chairs, the old photographs on the wall, all of it reminded him of a life he no longer felt worthy of. In a fit of rage, Jack began to destroy everything in sight. He flipped the table over, hurled a chair against the wall, and tore the old photographs to pieces. The sound of breaking furniture and falling objects filled the night, a chaotic symphony that mirrored the turmoil inside him. "Uncle Jack!" A voice rang out, high-pitched and trembling, cutting through his fury. Jack turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was Emma. The little girl stood frozen, her wide eyes filled with fear and worry. Jack stopped in his tracks, his chest heaving, and in that moment, he realized what he had done. He had let Emma see him like this. "Emma," Jack stammered, his voice hoarse. I I didn't." But before he could say anything more, Emma shouted, tears streaming down her face. "You're not a bad person. You saved other people, didn't you? Why can't you forgive yourself?" Her words hit Jack like a knife to the heart. He stood there, motionless, staring at her with empty eyes. She was crying, but in her eyes, Jack didn't see fear or anger. Instead, he saw pain, disappointment, not because he had scared her, but because she couldn't understand why he was destroying himself like this. "Don't you get it?" Emma continued, her voice breaking with sobs. "I know you've done hard things. I know you've lost people. But you're still here. You're still alive. You saved others, didn't you? So why can't you forgive yourself?" Jack felt as though everything around him was collapsing. He couldn't answer Emma, couldn't find any excuse for his actions. He only knew that she was right. He had survived, but he wasn't truly living. He had let the pain and guilt consume him, turning him into someone even he didn't recognize. Jack sank to his knees on the floor, his hands clutching his head. Tears streamed down his face for the first time in years. He cried not just from the pain, but from the realization. He couldn't keep living like this. He couldn't let fear and guilt destroy him any longer. Emma stepped closer, placing a small hand on Jack's shoulder. "I don't want you to be like this, Uncle Jack," she said, her voice small but filled with determination. "I need you. I need you to be strong, and I know you can be." Jack looked up at her, his tear-streaked face filled with a mix of shame and gratitude. She was only 10 years old, but her words carried the weight of someone far older. In that moment, Jack realized that he wasn't just living for himself. He was living for people like Emma, people who needed him, people who believed he could be better. "I'm sorry, Emma," Jack said, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry you had to see this. I'm sorry I let you down." Emma shook her head, her eyes shining with a quiet strength. "You didn't let me down. I just want you to try. You've done harder things than this, haven't you?" Jack nodded, feeling a faint glimmer of hope in the darkness. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he couldn't keep living like this. He had to change, not just for himself, but for Emma, for Danny, and for everyone who had believed in him. That night, after Emma had gone home, Jack sat alone in his wrecked living room. He looked around at the broken glass, the overturned furniture, the torn photographs, and he knew this would be the last time he let himself fall this far. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. Jack stood up and began to clean the room. Every shard of glass he picked up, every piece of furniture he set upright, every torn photograph he tried to piece back together felt like a small step toward repairing himself. And as the first light of dawn broke through the window, Jack knew he was ready to start again. Jack stood in front of the old iron gate, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The small house belonging to Margaret, Danny's mother, sat quietly amidst a garden full of trees. Yellow chrysanthemums bloomed along the pathway, but Jack couldn't bring himself to notice their beauty. His heart pounded in his chest, as if it were about to burst. He had been preparing for this moment for days, but now, standing before the door, he felt as though he couldn't take another step. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "I have to do this," he told himself. "Not for me, but for Danny, for the truth." With a moment of hesitation, Jack raised his hand and knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the quiet air, and just a few seconds later, the door opened. Margaret appeared, her small frame exuding a calm and quiet strength. She looked older than Jack remembered, her hair almost entirely gray, but her eyes still shone with a warmth he hadn't expected. When she saw Jack, she paused for a moment, then gave him a faint smile. "Jack," she said, her voice soft and gentle. "I thought you might come." Jack didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded, feeling his throat tighten. Margaret opened the door wider, gesturing for him to come inside. He stepped in, each step feeling heavier than the last. The small house was tidy and cozy, with family photos hanging on the walls. Jack's eyes landed on a picture of Danny as a child, his bright smile piercing Jack's heart like a knife. Margaret invited him to sit on the sofa and poured him a cup of tea. Jack sat there, his hands clasped together, unsure of how to begin. "There's no need to rush," Margaret said, as if she could read his mind. "I know you have something to say." Jack lifted his head, looking directly into her eyes. Those eyes held no blame or anger, only patience and understanding. That made it even harder for Jack to speak. He took a deep breath, then began, his voice trembling. "Mrs. Margaret," he started, "I came here to tell you the truth I've kept hidden all these years." Margaret didn't say anything, only nodded, encouraging him to continue. "That day," Jack said, his voice breaking, "we were ambushed. The enemy outnumbered us by far. I gave the order to retreat. If I hadn't, the entire team would have died. But I left Danny behind." Jack lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. He felt as though he were standing naked before judgment. "I tried to save him," he continued, his voice cracking. "But I couldn't. I failed. I let him die. And I can't forgive myself." The room fell into silence. Jack didn't dare lift his head, bracing himself for words of blame, anger, or even contempt from Margaret. But instead he heard her sigh, soft but full of emotion. "Jack," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm, "you don't need to blame yourself like this." Jack looked up, surprised. "But I left Danny to die. I gave the order to retreat. If it weren't for me, he might still be alive." Margaret shook her head, her eyes filled with understanding. "Danny wrote me a letter before he left," she said. "In that letter, he told me that he trusted you, Jack. He said he was proud to fight under your command. He knew you always did what was best for your team, and he never blamed you." Jack felt as though a massive weight had been lifted from his chest, but at the same time tears welled up in his eyes. He really said that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Margaret nodded, a sad smile appearing on her lips. "Danny was a strong person, Jack. He knew the risks of going to war, but he also knew that you did everything you could. He didn't want you to live with this guilt." Jack couldn't hold it in any longer. He broke down, tears streaming down his face, tears he had held back for so many years. Margaret stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder, comforting him like a mother would comfort her child. "Jack," she said, her voice soft but full of strength, "you survived, and you need to keep living, not just for yourself, but for Danny. His sacrifice wasn't so you could live in pain. He wanted you to cherish the life he helped protect." Her words were like a light piercing through the darkness in Jack's soul. He felt as though he had been freed from a burden he had carried for so many years. He didn't know if he could ever fully forgive himself, but he knew he couldn't keep living like this. "Thank you," Jack said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for forgiving me. Thank you for giving me a chance to start over." Margaret smiled, her eyes warm and kind. "You don't need to thank me, Jack. You just need to live well, for Danny, for those who believed in you." As Jack left the small house, he felt as though he had stepped out of a nightmare. The sky that day was clear, the sunlight warm on his face, and for the first time in years, Jack felt a glimmer of hope in his heart. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he was ready to move forward. Jack sat in a small room, soft light streaming in through the window, creating a warm and comforting atmosphere. In front of him was a group of people, all veterans, each carrying invisible wounds. A middle-aged man with tired eyes was sharing a story about the nightmares that kept him awake at night, about the guilt that weighed on his soul every single day. Jack listened intently, not interrupting, his gaze filled with understanding. "We've all been through things no one else can imagine," Jack said, his voice steady and calm as the man finished his story. "But we're still here. We still have the chance to do something meaningful, not just for ourselves, but for those who didn't make it back." Jack's words weren't just for the man in front of him, they were also for himself. Joining the veteran support group had been a turning point in Jack's life. At first, he had come seeking help, looking for a place where he could finally speak about the pain he had buried for so many years. But over time, he realized that listening to and helping others was also a way to heal himself. Jack was no longer the lonely man drowning in alcohol and guilt. He began to find purpose in helping others overcome PTSD, just as he had struggled with it himself. He shared his story openly, without hiding or avoiding the truth. He spoke about Danny, about Mike, about the difficult decisions he had to make, and about how he had learned to forgive himself. His stories weren't just words of comfort, they became a source of inspiration for others. Outside of the support group, Jack also spent time with Emma. She had become an important part of his life, a small but powerful light that helped him rediscover the meaning of living. Despite being just a young girl, Emma had taught Jack a profound lesson, that forgiveness and love could heal even the deepest wounds. Jack became a mentor to Emma, helping her navigate the challenges of life. He helped her with her homework, listened to her stories about school, and sometimes simply sat with her, sharing quiet moments of peace. Emma, with her innocence and kindness, helped Jack see the world in a way he had long forgotten. One afternoon, as Jack and Emma sat on the steps of his porch, she looked at him and asked, "Uncle Jack, do you still feel sad about Danny?" Jack was silent for a moment, gazing at the blue sky ahead. "Yes," he replied softly. "I think I'll always feel sad about him. But now, I don't feel guilty anymore. I know he would want me to keep living, and I'm trying to do that." Emma smiled, her eyes bright. "I think Danny would be really proud of you." Her words warmed Jack's heart. He knew he still had a long road ahead, but he also knew he was on the right path. One late autumn day, Jack stood before the war memorial, where the names of the fallen were etched into stone. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of leaves and earth. Jack held a white flower in his hand, walking slowly toward the cold, unyielding surface of the memorial. He stopped in front of the name he had carried in his heart for so many years, Danny Carter. Jack knelt down, placing the flower on Danny's name. He didn't cry, but his heart was full of emotion. This wasn't the first time he had come here, but this time it felt different. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace. For the first time, he felt as though he had truly let go of the burden he had carried for so long. "Danny," Jack whispered, his voice low and filled with emotion. "Thank you. Thank you for trusting me, for fighting beside me, and for giving me the chance to keep living. I'll live, Danny. I'll live for you." Jack stood up, his eyes gazing into the distance toward the horizon. He knew life would never be perfect, that the memories and pain would always be a part of him, but he also knew he had found the light at the end of the tunnel. He had learned to forgive himself, to cherish what he had, and to live a life that Danny would be proud of. As Jack left the memorial, he felt as though a new chapter in his life had begun. He was no longer the man haunted by his past, but a man ready to face the future and everything it had to offer. And in his heart, he knew Danny would always be there, like a guiding light, reminding him that life was worth living, that every day was an opportunity to do something meaningful. Jack walked away, the late afternoon sun casting its warm glow on his face, and for the first time in years, he smiled.